Is that all?
Yes, I can
That's
see
all
that
good.
fine.
You can see the screen.
Yeah, brilliant.
Great.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much. So thanks for the intro. So first of all, I put this slide up, which has got a picture of Crossrail Elizabeth line on it, and I guess that's sort of a bit of the theme of this discussion that we're going to have for the next hour or so, which is to look at these projects through perhaps a different lens sometimes. I think it's easy for us to look at projects, and I think Crossrails epitomizes that, and look at the negative. Look at, it was over budget. It was very late in terms of realizing that it was going to miss its commissioning deadlines, and it missed its commissioning deadlines by quite a long time. I think it's easy for us to sort of look at those things through that negative lens. But for those of you that know me, you probably know that I'm a bit more of a glass half full person, and I would say that Crossrail is, it's a staggering project. If you haven't been on it, the experience is, it's gold plated, right? That, the quality level of the entire experience of that railway is, is just fantastic and fantastically world class. Getting there was more of a challenge, but yeah. So I think that's sort of the two sides of that, the yin and the yang of what the UK represents in terms of its rail industry and its rail skills, is something that I really wanted to sort of spend a few minutes talking about with all of you and discussing. So just to sort of build on what Anup said about my background, yeah, I'm a civil engineer. I've largely worked in the rail sector for most of that career, not exclusively. Nearly 30 years now, 30 years I'll have been a civil engineer next year. It still doesn't feel like that. I feel like I've probably been doing it 10 years. So, hopefully for those of you that are listening that are a bit earlier in your careers, don't fret about that. So I don't feel old yet, maybe, but I obviously am. And I've done a range of roles with AECOM. The most recent I've been doing for the last 2.5 years is Global Transit Director. Transit is kind of perhaps a more US definition of really all forms of public passenger transportation, particularly rail, heavy rail, high-speed rail, light rail, metro, a little bit of BRT, bus rapid transit chucked in there as well. But yeah, and you can see my background there, and this is some of the stuff that I've worked on and places I've worked and companies I've worked for over the years. So if you're not very familiar with AECOM, or you might know AECOM from a UK perspective, I thought it was useful just to sort of illustrate a little bit more broadly what AECOM is all about. And so the context of my role in AECOM as the global transit lead. Transportation is the biggest part of what AECOM does. We employ 55,000 people all around the world. We're based in the US, headquartered in Dallas, in Texas. And in transportation, which includes roads and aviation and goods movement, as well as rail and transit. Transit is a big chunk of that, not the biggest, but we did a lot of revenue last year. And we did that across not just design, which is what you may know AECOM for in the UK, but also program management and kind of general engineering and consultancy services. If you're not sure what program management is, the sort of simplest way to describe it really is leading the delivery of projects, design and construction management, project controls, project management across either a portfolio of several smaller projects or over one big project, like a mega project. So AECOM is involved in those things as well, both in the UK, but particularly we do a lot of that in the US. And you can see on this slide some of the stuff that we are involved in all around the world. We're strong in our regional markets in mass transit and rail. And those markets that we cover and that I have a leadership role in North America, so US and Canada, UK and continental Europe and Ireland, Middle East and Africa, Asia, where I was last week at the Asia Pacific Rail Conference, and also Australia and New Zealand. Across all of those things, in transit and in rail, we're probably involved, I think, in all of the major high-speed rail programs around the world outside of China. We're heavily involved in renewals programs in lots of places. We're investing in rail systems and assurance capability. We see that as something that's increasingly in demand. Same with innovative funding models. We're investing in that, and that rooted in the UK. Both of those things, I would say, as well as collaborative delivery models. And overall, that's just all about being focused on helping our clients with their outcomes. I guess that's kind of similar to what we see from Network Rail's kind of one of their strap lines, putting passengers first. That's something that's very common. We see some form of that approach from lots of transit authorities all around the world. So AECOM helping our clients with their outcomes is something that we're striving to do all the time. So just to give you a bit of a perspective on AECOM, and that's kind of why I was interested in talking about sort of what is best in class, what the UK brings to worldwide best in class capabilities, just sort of drawing on the experience and the privilege that I have in my role at AECOM is to really see what we're doing and what our clients are doing in lots of different parts of the world. And I'm going to touch on some of that as we talk through these slides. So what I wanted to do first of all then, just to sort of kick off the meat of the presentation, is to just set a premise really and a challenge, and reflect on the challenge. All around the world, I think it's a very common theme around decarbonisation and that imperative to shift people onto public transport. When I took over my role 2.5 years ago, I thought one of the parts of it would be balancing peaks and troughs of workload around teams within AECOM in the rail sector all around the world. And that hasn't really happened because all around the world there's been huge unprecedented investment in rail programs. I think we're seeing a few headwinds driven by inflation in some markets, particularly in the UK, not just in the UK, and the big capital costs that governments are committing to, but generally, it is a very booming market all around the world. And what can the UK bring to that? Really, that's my challenge. But the premise is, I think the UK has a huge amount to offer globally, and I think what we are delivering in many cases is best in class, either in terms of experience or in capability. It's very easy when we're in the middle of delivering projects and we're working on projects in the UK to not realise that, actually, and it's very difficult to take a step back and look at what we're doing and through the lens of kind of what other countries are doing and what other transit authorities and rail authorities are doing, and to be able to look at that. So that's my premise. What I'm going to do then is I want to talk a little bit next about what I see as and AECOM sees as some of the trends in transit and rail around the world. And I think you'll recognise a lot of those are common to the UK. Then I'm going to just depress everybody a little bit, and I'm going to reflect on the current state of UK industry in rail, because there's definitely a few things that we can sort of be a bit doom and gloom about, and then hopefully build up a bit more enthusiasm and recognition around lots of the things that I think that we're doing that are best in class. And then I'm going to sort of finish up by sharing a little bit of what I see as really good practice from other places around the world. And then hopefully, if you've got some questions, I really hope that, you might have some, feel free to disagree with what I'm going to talk about for the next half an hour or so that I've got left in terms of timing of the session before we give you some floor for comments and questions. But yeah, hopefully I'll have set the scene and you'll have a few questions at the end. So these are some of the trends that certainly AECOM sees in transit. I've already talked about decarbonisation and modal shift. Lots of countries, lots of cities are toying with different types of congestion models. Even my own home city where I live in Bath now has a charging model. It's a bit soft at the moment. I'm sure they're going to ratchet that up to catch more drivers and more users in the future, but that's happening all over the place. In terms of cost, I mentioned already there are inflationary and budgetary pressures. Not everywhere. Plenty of countries don't have the same inflationary challenges that the UK has got, but there's definitely either inflationary or budgetary challenges. Capital rail projects, the demand around the world is very high, and that is also, not just inflation generally, but it's sort of the scarcity of rail skills and resources versus the amount of investment that's happening is another cost pressure challenge. More widely, though, I think we see this in the UK around operating deficits. Countries are running their rail networks and there are fewer riders post-pandemic, right? There's less commuting. I think in the UK, we probably say, I think RIA would say, well, it's not all doom and gloom in that space. There's a lot more leisure commuters. There's a lot of areas where, there's more ridership than there was pre-pandemic, but there's definitely, fewer season ticket holders. The profile of ridership and passengers in the UK has changed. If I compare that to what is happening in other parts of the world, I mentioned I just came back from Southeast Asia. Traffic there is still crazy. People are back in offices. Ridership is in high demand there. But in America, there are lots of parts of America where their rail networks, particularly their urban metro networks, are much, much lower than they were pre-pandemic. Some still as low as 30% of pre-pandemic ridership. And that then obviously creates funding challenges in terms of operating deficits, but also challenges in terms of what governments want to spend money on. Do they want to spend money on rail networks? Do they want to spend it on energy networks, healthcare, even defence? And I think, that then leads to this point that I've made here, this third bullet, around uncertainty about what does the passenger of the future look like, given that the timescales for capital investment in a railway is, 5 years minimum. Some of these mega projects, 20 years or more between sort of initiation and implementation. What does the passenger of the future look like? And that is certainly a difficult challenge in terms of decision making around capital programs, business cases. Even in the UK, we're seeing that, aren't we? Right, where the enhancements program to build extra capacity in the network pre-pandemic, that just doesn't work anymore. We need to look at investment in the UK rail network in a very different lens to what we did before. I think there's a few other key challenges. Digital. Everybody's talking about digital. Certainly, it was a big theme of the Asia Pacific conference that I was at last week. I think we talk about this quite a lot all around the world. I think we big ourselves up quite a bit as well. I think we're pretty good in certain areas. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation. But I think we also oversell it a bit. I think we are doing digital twins. I think they're quite simplistic digital twins. We're still on a journey with all of this. So lots of uncertainty around that. And then just touching on some other areas, traction power. I still meet clients all around the world who are reluctant to commit to things like 25 kV overhead power traction upgrades because they think battery technology is coming or hydrogen technology is coming. There is a lot of uncertainty around the appropriateness of different solutions and different applications and different suitability for different types of rail network. I'm not going to touch on these last ones too much in the time. You can see some of these. I will just touch on the systems thinking piece. I think we're really good at this in the UK. If you haven't read the ICE stuff on systems thinking, I commend it to you. I think it's really good. It builds on some of the experience from Crossrail, amongst other projects. But I was reading The Economist the other day, and they were talking about the need for governments to be more effective in driving, improvements for nations. And they were talking about the need for government to bring systems thinking to their departments. And I was reflecting on the fact that if The Economist is writing about the application of systems thinking to governments, then we absolutely should be embracing it, and in many cases we are embracing it as a rail industry. I think the final point I make here on this slide is just around modal choices, particularly with ridership being low. See this in the US amongst other places. There's definitely a conversation happening around what kind of last mile and city-based solutions clients need to invest in, whereas previously that discussion was much more strongly focused on heavy rail. Now that it's uncertainty about the cost of operating heavy rail, and our alternatives like bus rapid transit, even very light rail, electric buses, automation, self-driving vehicles. These are kind of modal choice conversations that clients are having all around the world. So if I stop for a second and and reflect on that slide and this, which is a global slide, right? Global trends in transit that AECOM sees. I certainly feel, and I hope you do listening to this, that there's a lot of these things that you recognise apply to the UK as well, and that's kind of where I think it's easy to get caught up if you're working in the UK to think the kind of standards and the kind of approaches that we have to our work in the rail sector in the UK constrains us from working overseas. And I would argue strongly that that's not the case, that there's so much more that we have in common with other markets around the world, particularly these kinds of challenges, as well as delivery challenges for capital projects, etc., etc. It vastly outweighs, any differences we have, cultural differences, standards differences. So that's kind of the sort of the point that I wanted to make here. So I wanted to reflect on sort of what's happening in the UK rail sector at the moment, and I think it is easy to sort of be negative about things. The rail industry ridership is down. It's not down as much as it was through the pandemic. Obviously, I think the government subsidy through the pandemic peaked at about £17 billion. I think the subsidy this year is 11 billion. It's still huge. Ridership, no question, it is down. It's good in certain areas, as I've said, but season tickets, commuters, people are not coming back to work in the same way in many cases that they were, 3 days in the office, agile working. These are sort of common approaches that we see, and it's affecting ridership. Performance is down as the industry is, striving to save money, and industrial relations are still a bit tough. I came back from Kuala Lumpur on Friday. It took me 12 hours to fly into Heathrow. It took me about the same time on Saturday morning to get to the West Country because of the strikes. We all work in the sector. We're probably a bit more encouraged to persevere with travelling by train. I'm fearful for the impact that has on commuters, and what choices they have are often marginal decisions. GBRTT, we heard the other day on the news that it's probably not going to be part of the government's legislative agenda. That fuels uncertainty. Inflation I've talked about, and I think there is investment. No question, there's investment in the UK rail sector. I think it's a huge privilege that there is so much investment, but it is concentrated on some larger projects, particularly HS2. I think there's a bit more going on. A lot more going on around decarbonisation in Scotland, some interesting stuff going on in Wales, but there's definitely some challenges in terms of investment in England in the industry. So a bit more on this. Electrification progress obviously is slow. There's not a lot going on in the south of England. Restoring your railways, I think really just epitomised sort of tapping into the British psyche of railways. We invented the railway in the UK. I think any member of the public, would recognise the role of the railway in the UK. I think when that Restoring Your Railways investment came from the government, maybe we might have had a slightly more critical eye on it as the UK rail industry, but certainly I feel like the the public at large, could really get their heads around something like, reversing beaching, reversing the beaching cuts, and sort of bringing railways back. I think there's always an appetite for that, but the pipeline is somewhat limited in terms of the next phase of projects. I've touched on Crossrail challenges, and if you saw in my bio, I worked on Great Western electrification. I led the design team, and so it'd be remiss of me not to have full disclosure. That was not a happy place for the industry, overcoming the challenges on that project. And similarly, we're seeing government decisions on HS2 changing the scope or slowing down progress at places like Euston and other parts of that. So yeah, lots of challenges around the UK sector right now. But I think, going back to my premise at the start of this, I think that we can be much more positive about what we've done and what we're doing. And I definitely think we've built on Brunel's legacy, over the last 100 years and over the last recent few years as well. So that's what I'm going to talk about now, is where are the real bright spots of the stuff that we're doing, and taking a step back and looking at those and trying to recognize those and celebrate those a little bit more. So the first one then, collaboration. For those of you that are earlier in your careers, I was just starting as a young graduate civil engineer in 1994 when the Latham report came out, Rethinking Construction. And I guess, we are probably used to, particularly as a rail industry, seeing lots of reports from government initiatives on how things need to improve. But I do think this, certainly at the time, was very seismic in terms of its recommendations and its pretty sharp take on, an insightful take on the overall UK construction industry. These phrases: adversarial relations, ineffective outcomes, incapable of delivering for its clients. Those are strong words, lacking respect for employees. And it wasn't just critical, it did recommend outcomes and the need for change, particularly recognising what was happening in places like Australia already around the need for better partnering and more collaborative outcomes. I certainly recall working as a fairly young designer with contractors and with clients. There was a lot less design and build in those days as well. It was kind of much more IC 5th edition type contracts, where there was a sort of resident engineer, supervising engineer model. And no question, there was huge conflict, legal fees, poorly delivered projects. And at the same time, AECOM in Australia, there was an approach that was different to that around alliancing. AECOM wrote a book about it, as you can see from the slides here. It's a free book, so you can download it. It hit me up if you can't find it online, and it has been used very much in the UK sector. I'll touch on this a little bit more in the next slide. But what I wanted to do, just to sort of reflect on this a little bit, was where we were in 1994. Even in the early 2000s, there was a lot of, there was a move towards alliancing in the UK sector on the West Coast. It was a bit of an inauspicious start to alliancing. The West Coast didn't go well, and we moved away from it for a few years after that, but we've definitely come back to it now. But what I wanted to just take a stock on is, I think it's really crept up on us how much collaboration has become a part of our collective approach in the UK in rail industry. It's very rare I think, to see a procurement of a major project where there isn't behavioural assessments built into it. There's lots of alliancing, lots of evidence of successful alliancing, which I'll talk about in a minute. I think clients are very open. You might disagree with that, but my experience of working and talking to clients in other parts of the world, I mean, just a bit of an anecdote, really. I went to Scotland to meet the Network Rail team up there last year with my colleague Stephen Murdoch, the rail lead, who was at the time the rail lead up there. He runs our UK rail team now for AECOM. We went up to see the client, and almost the first thing that the client did was apologise for a lack of transparency in the pipeline. And they were concerned because they didn't have funding secured and therefore they couldn't share it. But they recognised that as an industry, we need to know what the pipeline is so we can plan and we can, be ready for it and run our businesses accordingly. And it wasn't really their fault, but I think it just it's down to Treasury funding and lots of other factors. But I think that is not an experience that I see a lot of in other parts of the world. Projects get dropped on the industry last minute. Sometimes that's driven by concerns around creating a level playing field and legal challenge. But I do find the clients here are very open and very accessible in comparison with some of their peers around the world. I think those adversarial behaviours maybe in client teams and in supply chain, that has been called out a lot. And I think overall, there's much more trust in how we deliver projects in the UK rail sector. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect, don't get me wrong, but certainly I think in comparison with where we were 30 years ago, we have moved on an awful long way. So just flowing on from that then is alliancing. And I think there have been a lot of really successful alliance-based contracts in the UK rail sector over the last 10 years or so. I mentioned earlier that West Coast didn't go so well. And I think there was certainly a tone for some years after that. We don't want to touch this. We tried it and it didn't work. And then I think there came a realization that actually it had been done wrong on the West Coast, and if we were going to do it, we should do it properly. The Northern Hub also cord project that Skanska and BAM delivered with AECOM and McDonald as the designers, the JV designers. They followed that the guidance in the book that I mentioned on the previous slide pretty closely, and I think really successful project. I think the Stafford Alliance that I think is Atkins and Volkers delivered, hugely successful. Just all of these projects enabling clients to deliver much more effectively to program and budget, and also, enabling the supply chain to get the successful outcomes as well in terms of profitable projects that mean that we can build capability, invest in our teams, and move on to the next project. It's really positive, I think, if you're not aware already, because it's in procurement, but HS2 have embraced an alliancing model with their rail systems procurement. So I think that is an indictment of the success. And then more deeply than these sort of big one-shot capital projects that have been successful alliances, I think the Renewals alliances in the rail sector that Network Rail have been running for a few years, I think they are really providing a best-in-class outcome. They enable long-term investment from the supply chain in capabilities, in understanding what the client needs are, in being able to unlock efficiencies. I think the KPIs that those alliance contracts have keep everybody focused on the outcomes that the clients need. And over time, we see baked in those efficiencies. Those participants have to commit under the contract to percentage efficiencies year on year. But what we've seen, I think, over a few years now, are performance going up, costs going down, and savings being realised. You might not see all of those cost savings because sometimes they're being reinvested in things like better safety or better handback of engineering works, or investing in more sustainable approaches to delivery. Things like getting rid of diesel generators and minimizing diesel on the sites, or investing in innovation like induction welding, things like that. So loads of real positives around the alliancing approach. And I have to put a plug in for something I'm really keen for us to see as a UK industry, which is an alliance-based program, long-term program of electrification of the UK rail network. I think that would be a really sustainable long-term approach to delivering electrification much more efficiently than we've seen over recent years. So then flowing through from that, again, just wanted to touch on renewals. It's really easy, I think, to look at how renewals progress at the moment, particularly track and the rail systems renewals, and forget how challenging and difficult this all was not many years ago. And it's kind of taken as a bit of a norm now that that this is done well. And I think that all around the world this is still a challenge. But I think that what we've unlocked in the UK sector with renewals, particularly with the alliances and a collaborative approach, applying that to renewals, are these that sort of next stage of opportunities of efficiency, because the quality is really good, typically on these projects, because they've built progressive assurance in, we're able to hand back the railway at higher speeds. We're able to drive more safety, more efficiency, better quality, less disruption to the passengers, and ultimately this is all about minimizing disruption to passengers, and particularly now that there's a shift towards more leisure use of the railway. I think that there's probably more to explore in the opportunities that have come out of more efficient renewals. If I contrast that with what's happening all around the world, I just want to sort of, first of all, lots of clients still do their renewals in-house. And I think that tends to, in my view, that tends to lean towards doing things very traditionally, rather than looking at a kind of more innovative models. I don't think, I'm kind of reluctant to use the word innovative when it comes to how the UK renewals and alliances work, because it's kind of business as usual now. It's definitely not for other parts of the world. In the US, renewals is called State of Good Repair, SOGR, and it is a huge challenge. Alongside their cost of operations, the lack of passenger revenues, their ability to invest in renewals is really squeezed at the moment, to the extent, I think, on the Boston Transit Authority, the T, they have actually had to close down some rail lines because they can't guarantee the safety, because they're not able to invest in state of good repair renewals. So, that is the position that other parts of the world are sometimes in. And I think the UK model is absolutely best in class. The future of that, of course, we're seeing it now with CP7 proposals from Network Rail, the SID model in Southern, where the contractors have been appointed, Agile Client Eastern, lots of different approaches that Network Rail regions are taking to the CP7 renewals. And I think, that to me is something that, there are some downsides to that in terms of how do we track that as a supply chain, different parts of the client team wanting different approaches. I see that as more positive, that we with the client are going to be exploring what's the most efficient way to deliver these renewals. How can we achieve the renewals outcomes that we need with the pressure on budgets that we've got from UK government at the moment. So I think that is something that it's going to be really interesting to see the outcomes of that through the next 5-year renewal cycle. So just to change the dynamic a little bit and talk about digital, I think if I look back on digital over the course of the last sort of 15 years or so, it's fascinating to see that the US mandated BIM on its projects, for public sector projects, in 2008, and the UK came about 8 years later. I would say generally, I think we're pretty far ahead of the US, certainly in application of BIM and our thinking, drone technology, 4D BIM. I've seen lots of investment over the last 10 years. Lang O'Rourke, I think, have been really good at this, investing in their DFMA manufacturing facility quite a few years ago now, that's embedded in their approach. But it's really good to see other contractors in the sector working on 4D and embracing it. AECOM has a project with SLC, our partners in the Midlands, to renew the station at university in Birmingham. We're the program partner. Volcus are the contractor. Super digital approach that Volcus have taken with their designer, Mott MacDonald, on that project. So yeah, I think it's really threaded through a lot of what we do in the UK. It's not perfect. I think we've still got a lot to do. And it's good that HS2 have set that high standard as well for their project information models. That's kind of in the design and delivery phase, and in what they expect from their asset information models, their digital twin, when that railway moves into operation. I do think, though, just sort of jumping across to that point at the bottom of my slides, I do think we talk a lot about digital twins. There is a lot of talk about it around the world. I don't really think anybody has got to a level of digital twin that is anything other than, at the moment, quite simplistic. I think in terms of getting to a digital twin where it's tied to a timetable model, it's tied to live on-train data, and we've got a properly integrated model of a railway. I think we've got a heck of a journey to go still on that. So talking about the digital twins where we are now, which I think are more simplistic, I think we've got some more work to do there. Just another couple of areas, I think digital consents management, public engagement with our projects and consents, I think historically been done very traditionally. The pandemic has driven, approaching that in a much more digital way. And I think that's unlocked a conversation with people who are more passively viewing our major projects rather than just the people who maybe see it negatively from a disruption point of view. So, unlocking digital consents management, I think, is another really interesting area where the UK has embraced that deeply. And then similarly, lots of conversations about AI and machine learning. We did a project last year, maybe the year before, with Network Rail and a software company, taking the line-side videos from on train and assessing those through machine learning for devegetation management. And I think that whole approach to AI and machine learning, it's a huge conversation at the moment. I think the UK can play a leading part in that, and we can continue to do that, building on the great foundation that we've got through embracing BIM, 4D BIM, DFMA, etc., etc. Just sort of another area then that I think a few other areas to pick on. I think we don't share these enough, really, but I think there's been some stuff that we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years that I think is a great way of engaging and sharing what we do around the world with a bit of pride. I think, project speed, has been, and pace, that Network Rail have used. I think, we've applied that as an industry to a bunch of projects at the moment. There are various stages of being able to capitalize on the ambition of accelerating those and reducing the cost. We're doing that in a very inflationary environment, of course. So, difficult to see what the cost might have been if we hadn't applied those. But I definitely feel that the approach to project speed, simplifying our processes, managing the risks in a more efficient way, trying to focus on outcomes for passengers and for communities through a minimum viable product approach. These are ways of thinking about delivering our capital projects that the UK is at the forefront of, and other clients around the world are fascinated and interested in how that's working. And I think it's good to see that happening on the Dartmoor line, delivered successfully last year. It looks like a very successful project in terms of its passenger ridership. The Northumberland line that AECOM is involved in, a lot of companies are involved in delivering. I think that's a real opportunity for us to prove that we can do something much quicker and open that line in the coming year. And it's good to see that the Portishead line was, a contractor was appointed for that. I think, was it Volcus? Were appointed to that to keep that project moving fairly recently. That's in my neck of the woods down in the West Country. Land value capture is something that lots of clients talk about, different ways of funding projects. It has been applied successfully on the Northumberland line. It's part of the funding model. I think we've got to make that work in other places where we can, if we're to drive investment in the rail sector, both in the UK and around the world. And then just a couple of images here on the Crossrail learning legacy. I think, this is the big thing for me about Crossrail is, it's not about going around telling the world it's a fantastic project. I think there is an element of sharing with pain around this. It's been really pleasing to see Mark Wilde doing a bit of a tour and doing some online sharing. He was at APTA, which is the American Public Transport Association, last year, talking about the lessons learned from Crossrail. Do this again, but definitely don't do that. Really good sharing of Crossrail is a great project, but next time we can do better. And I think that's another area that the UK can really share with customers and clients around the world is, we did it this way, it didn't quite work. Don't make the mistakes that we made. Build on that and do it differently, and let us help you shape that to make sure that you capture the learning. Colin Brown, who was the chief engineer from 2018 when things kind of started to go wrong, was the commissioning chief engineer. I think that's his title. He's written a really good paper on the digital learning as well. Some really good outcomes and recommendations that Colin makes. It ties in really well with the systems thinking that I mentioned earlier. That's a free issue paper that he's written. Lots in there that is really good sharing of lessons from Crossrail. And then just a couple of other things that I'm going to touch on before I share some of the things that are going on elsewhere around the world, and hopefully I'm doing all right for time, is around the environmental sustainability strategy that Network Rail did. So as I've mentioned right at the top of this talk, lots of clients looking at decarbonisation and modal shift, and really pleased that Network Rail sort of took the bull by the horns on this. I think about 18 months ago now. AECOM helped with this approach, but it was very much led by Network Rail's most senior leadership and non-executive governance board as well. And I think the commitments that they made, not just to decarbonisation, but also recognising the role that they play in things like biodiversity and energy management of, they're a big energy user. These are things that other clients around the world are at some stage in the journey on. Many of them still at the beginning of that journey, others a bit more advanced. But, this is something that, again, I think that we've embraced in the UK. Network Rail are definitely applying decarbonisation and net zero approaches to their supply chain expectations. And, I think we can see more of that in much the same way that we've seen things like social value be something that's critical to procurement decisions by key rail clients, not just in the UK actually, but all around the world. And then finally, I don't think any presentation on sort of UK best practice and best in class would be complete without recognising our approach to safety. I think objectively, if you look at the data, we are a very, very safe railway in terms of protecting the passengers and our users as well as our workforce. That is absolutely not to say that we are ever complacent. I think it's really good to see the former PWI president, Nick Millington, driving digital adoption to protect frontline workers. But I think, there's much more to it than that. Our entire culture, the safety leadership, both from our private sector supply chain and from our clients, with things like Shell groups, I think that safety culture is just absolutely world class. Things like safety and design, I think, are really there's robust discussions about what designers need to do all the time. And also, be interested in other people's views on this. But I think the common safety method, the European approach, my view is that we've fully embraced that in the UK rail sector. That's not to say we haven't got more to do, but I think we've gone a long way to embrace the the ideas and the approaches that I think are really good in CSM, and we apply them, wholeheartedly to our projects. I'm not sure whether that's the same in Europe, actually. Something I probably need to take away and have a look at. But yeah, loads in safety that I think we've got to be proud of. And I think it's vital to share that around the world with other clients who are at a different stage in their safety journey and their safety performance journey. Last but one slide then, in terms of what I wanted to talk about, is just to share a little bit about what's going on in other regions. I mean, I have talked about it a little bit, but I thought I'd just try and summarize it. The first thing to sort of work from left to right on this, North America, if you're not aware of it, the Biden administration has secured an enormous funding package called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which, at least in part, is aimed at decarbonising and catching up on historic underinvestment in transit. So yeah, there is a huge amount going on there. Amtrak, which is the sort of national passenger line operator, or the national passenger service operator, should I say, they've got an additional $80 billion or so of revenue over and above what they normally spend to invest in improvements, and it's across all of the US. So there's a huge amount there that's happening, and that is a wave of investment that we're going to see over the next few years, no question. I think security is a focus in the US. The ridership and the demographics that use the ridership are very different in the US to elsewhere in the world, and that means safety and people feeling safe to travel on transit networks is a big challenge for them, and it's a focus and it's an area of expertise for them. The other thing I'd say about North America is, while they have very traditional delivery models in the US, in Canada, it's great to see that a lot of the collaborative approaches that I've talked about are being brought to Canada, and they're embracing them. I think that is not least because the chief executive of Metrolinx, which is a big client in Canada, is a guy called Phil Verster, who is formerly of this parish, was Network Rail senior leader before he went over there. So yeah, that's what's happening in the US. In the Middle East, different challenges. There is a huge investment in some of their big cities in the Middle East, like Neom, and there is a spine railway. We're delivering that as the engineer and designer. The accelerated pace of that is enormous, but we're also seeing those conversations and that appetite to deliver quickly on other Saudi projects and other parts of the Middle East as well. So yeah, lots of rapid delivery ambition in the Middle East. I think in wider Europe, gosh, the French and Spanish and Italian experience of high-speed rail, I think, is something that everybody is drawing upon. Really pleased, AECOM has a big capability of this based in Madrid. But yeah, definitely that is an area where I see that the rail industry in continental Europe is technically strong. And then just an interesting angle from Scandinavia is we're being asked to baseline the carbon footprint of our projects, and through the detailed design and the development phase of those projects, we're being asked to ensure that we reduce the carbon footprint. So yeah, different baselines, different approaches. So really interesting stuff going on in continental Europe. Asia, leading in metro capability, just got back from there. I think in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Bangkok, some fantastic metro projects that are just kind of getting delivered. Not seeing the challenges that we see elsewhere. Similarly, Mumbai Metro, Line 3, that's going to open. I think it was a little bit delayed due to pandemic, but it's going to open at the end of this year. So they just kind of get on with it. And I think that the integration in Asia between rail systems and the civil engineering aspects of metro and rail projects is something that they do very, very well. So yeah, lots going on there. And in Singapore and Hong Kong in particular, the scale and complexity of their engineering is second to none. And then Australia, just to finish up really, staggering investment in their rail networks. I think there's a little bit of a headwind about inflation. There's been a little bit of a slight slowdown in recent weeks. But for example, we've built Crossrail, and we're not sure when the next Crossrail might come in the UK to London. Australia are building 3 Crossrails, 2 in Sydney, at least 1 in Melbourne, if not 2 in Melbourne. So yeah, the scale of investment in Australia is huge. I think it's really insightful, not only their alliancing approach, but their approach to diversity and inclusivity in terms of First Nations engagement. It's amazing how they've embraced the First Nations culture, and they're bringing it to their projects, recognizing that transit projects are linked to their communities that they serve. So yeah, lots of stuff, lots of positive stuff going on in Australia and New Zealand as well. I think with that, just some concluding remarks, really. Hopefully you've seen, I think there is a lot that the UK industry can be proud of. I think, we should share with pride, but like Mark Wilde and Colin Brown have done a little bit, sharing with pain. These were challenges, we overcame them, we're proud of that, but don't do it like this again, right? And learn from this. And I think, you can see the other bullet points there, but I will just sort of leave you with a thought, and that is, wherever I go around the world working, in my role with AECOM, there's a bunch of Brits in leadership roles and a bunch of people with experience from the UK. Phil Verster has gone from the UK, I think he's South African, but he's gone from UK experience to Canada. Andy Byford is now Amtrak's high-speed rail leader. If I go to the Middle East, loads of the client teams are expat Brits. So yeah, there's a load of British senior leadership building on a load of the stuff that I've talked about and more, and sharing it and embedding it into what they're doing all around the world. And I just want to encourage you, if you're thinking about it, lots of others are doing it and making big contributions. Don't be afraid, you can do the same. And I think with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and but there might be some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Russell. That was very fascinating. Yeah, it's great to hear about the kind of the global market, really, just understanding what's going on elsewhere in the world. It's not something that's at the forefront of my mind, so it's great hearing about that. Very interesting as well. But noting time, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, so there are a few questions that have come up in the chat and a few people are typing away. So I'm going to start off with one from Jonathan Harris. By the way, while I'm reading these out, if you want to elaborate the people that have asked them, please do feel free to jump on. He's asked, in the collaborative space and mentorship, learning, risk management, do you think that the working from home approach works in complex delivery of complicated rail projects, full stop?
Jonathan, it's a cracking question, actually. It's really interesting. All around the world, there's lots of different approaches to this. And in fact, even before this started, Joan and Anap and I were just chatting about sort of the back to work environment. Yeah, I mean, I would like to say that it does. I think it's kind of got to, because I think we made it work pretty successfully through the pandemic, and on big projects that AECOM's working on. We're certainly working all around the world. It's a bit of a struggle for people like me when you have different time zones and your working day gets stretched. You've kind of got to be a bit careful about that. I mean, my view is I think there needs to be a mix. So, for example, we're working on California high-speed rail. They expect people with loads of high-speed rail experience. There aren't many of those in the US, but they also expect California professional engineer qualification. So I think, there is a conversation to be had with clients about how to best bring the right experience that they need and yet be respectful of people's aspiration to spend time with their families, the necessity to work face to face, which I still think has a huge importance. I don't think we can discount it entirely by any means, but I think some kind of hybrid, and for those kinds of projects, I guess it might be a week in country with the client and 3 weeks away, or some mix like that. Or it might be 2 or 3 days in the office and a couple of days working from home. I think that's a balance that we should have. I will say I see clients around the world at both extremes. Some clients not in the office at all, and I think that's to their detriment, and other clients insisting that everybody is in the office full time. And again, I think that's to their detriment to some extent as well, because I think people can choose with their feet whether they want to really work on those. So yeah, I do think we kind of need to demonstrate to those clients the bits of working remotely that work successfully, and the bits of working face to face that we can't let go of, like building a culture, having difficult conversations, working face to face, integration of projects. Those are just some of the things that I think work better face to face. Great question.
Thank you, Russell. Got another question from Abigail Cahan. I hope I've said that correctly. She said, in what way or ways would you say the US ridership demographics vary from elsewhere? And she'd like to hear a bit more about how that affects security.
Yeah, no, happy to. Well, I'll do my best. I mean, I have a colleague who works for me as part of my team, Sally Librera. She's our US transit lead. She was previously the chief operating officer of the New York City subway. So she's got absolute first-hand experience of this. But what I've seen, and this is kind of me working with my team and with colleagues at ACOM and clients and traveling on ridership on some of these systems like the New York subway, BART in San Francisco, DART in the Dallas area, rapid transit in Texas. And I think, the demographics are, it is definitely something that is seen as a bit more of, in some cases, sort of a last resort option. If you have a car, you will drive, and their infrastructure is very much geared towards, not having walkable places, not having integrated transport, and prioritizing the car. There is definitely still quite a lot of that. I think the whole approach to decarbonisation and modal shift, and maybe with the Biden Infrastructure and Jobs Act, the aim is to change some of that. But the consequence of that is you tend to get demographics of people who are at the less fortunate end of the social spectrum, and that then means security in terms of people feeling safe, criminality, fare evasion. These are some of the behaviours that are, I wouldn't say prevalent, but they're perhaps a bit more, they experience a bit more of that in the US than they might do, for example, in the UK. And the consequence of that is you end up with a vicious circle where then you're putting off people who, the kind of people that you want to encourage to use the service. So those are some of the challenges, and that is leading to even greater reluctance for ridership from people who've got choices. And I think in every city, even in the UK, people have choices. It might be somewhat different here, but I think in the US, choices are marginal. It doesn't take much to tip people over to going back to their cars rather than traveling on transit. And I think that's some of the stuff that I think we're seeing in those kinds of places. Good question. Thanks, Abigail.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've had one more question, but unfortunately, time's up. Sorry, Mugdad. So you've got one more, but I just wanted to say thank you very much. It's a very fascinating topic you've presented on today. I've definitely learned a lot, and I think in the time-honoured way that we show us appreciation, I think a bit of a clap from everyone.
Digital clap.
Yeah, the PWI way. So yeah, so once again, thank you very much, and thank you all from everyone who joined us today, and have a good day.
My pleasure. Thanks everybody for taking the time to listen. All the best.
Cheers. Bye.